In 2009, a 17-year-old girl from Cedar Falls, Iowa, vanished without a trace on prom night, leaving behind only her silver heels on the gymnasium floor and a community haunted by unanswered questions. But 15 years later, a Thrift shop employee sorting through donated clothes would discover something that would reignite the investigation and force a mother to confront the darkest night of her life. Linda Caldwell sat at her kitchen table on a cold February morning, the steam from her coffee cup rising like ghosts in the pale winter light filtering through her window. At 53, she carried herself with the careful composure of someone who had learned to function, despite a wound that never fully healed. The house around her was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that had settled into every corner after. Her daughter Sophie disappeared 15 years ago. She reached for the morning newspaper, a habit she'd maintained even in the digital age, her fingers automatically turning to the local news section. It was there, buried between a story about school board elections and a feature on winter road maintenance, that she saw the headline that would change everything. Evidence in cold case discovered at local thrift shop. Linda's hands began to tremble as she read the opening lines. The article was brief, clinical in its language, but the words hit her like physical blows. A prom dress, vintage 2009, discovered among donated items at Second Chance's Thrift on Elm Street. The dress matched the description of the one worn by Sophie Caldwell on the night she disappeared. The coffee cup slipped from Linda's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, the dark liquid spreading like spilled ink across the boards. She didn't notice. Her entire world had narrowed to those few paragraphs, to the impossible possibility that, after all these years, Sophie might finally be coming home to her. Linda's mind raced back to that terrible night in May 2009. Sophie had been so excited about prom, spending weeks planning every detail. The dress had been a deep emerald green, chosen to complement her auburn hair and green eyes. It had cost more than Linda could comfortably afford as a single mother working 2 jobs. But seeing the joy on Sophie's face when she tried it on had made every extra shift worth it. That night, Sophie had looked like a princess stepping out of a fairy tale. Her date, Tyler Matthews, had arrived promptly at 7, nervous and polite in his rented tuxedo. Linda had taken dozens of photos, documenting every moment, every smile, every laugh. She had no way of knowing they would be the last pictures she would ever take of her daughter. The call had come at 11:30 that night. Principal Harrison's voice had been tight with concern as he explained that Sophie had vanished from the dance sometime between 10 and 10:30. Her silver heels had been found abandoned near the emergency exit that led to the school parking lot. Her purse was still at her table, her phone inside, fully charged, but silent. Linda had driven to the school in her pajamas, her heart hammering against her ribs as she joined the growing crowd of parents and students searching the building and surrounding grounds. The police had arrived within an hour, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they combed every inch of the property. But Sophie was gone, as if she had simply evaporated into the spring air. Now, 15 years later, Linda stared at the newspaper article through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Her daughter's dress, found in a thrift shop. How was it possible? Who had donated it? And more importantly, what had happened to the girl who had been wearing it that night? She reached for her phone with shaking hands and dialed the number listed in the article for Detective Marcus Rivera, the officer now handling Sophie's cold case. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, before a deep, careful voice answered. Detective Rivera. This is Linda Caldwell, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm calling about the article in this morning's paper, about the prom dress. That was my daughter's dress. Sophie Caldwell. She disappeared 15 years ago. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Linda could hear the rustling of papers, the sound of a man gathering his thoughts. When Detective Rivera spoke again, his voice was gentle but professional. Mrs. Caldwell, I've been reviewing your daughter's case file. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you. Can you come to the station this morning? I'd like to show you what we've found and discuss the next steps in the investigation. Linda looked around her kitchen, at the broken coffee cup she still hadn't cleaned up, at the newspaper spread across the table with its terrible, hopeful headline. After 15 years of silence, of dead ends and false leads, something had finally shifted in Sophie's case. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said, already reaching for her coat. As she hung up the phone, Linda caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was older, grayer, marked by years of grief and unanswered questions. But for the first time in 15 years, there was something else in her eyes. Hope. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, leaving the broken cup and spilled coffee behind. Today, she was going to see her daughter's dress again. Today, she might finally get some answers about what happened to Sophie on that terrible prom night so long ago. The Cedar Falls Police Department hadn't changed much in 15 years. Linda pushed through the heavy glass doors into the familiar lobby, the scent of stale coffee and industrial cleaning supplies triggering memories she'd tried to suppress. This was where she'd spent countless hours in those first desperate weeks after Sophie vanished. Detective Marcus Rivera was waiting for her at the front desk, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and graying temples. He extended his hand. As she approached, his grip firm but gentle. "Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for coming so quickly." "I know this can't be easy," Linda nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed him through a maze of cubicles to a small conference room where a cardboard evidence box sat waiting on the table. "I've been assigned to review several cold cases from that time period," Detective Rivera said, settling into the chair across from her. "Your daughter's case has always bothered me. Too many unanswered questions." He opened a thick manila folder and spread several photographs across the table. Linda's breath caught as she recognized the images from that night. Sophie in her emerald dress, radiant and smiling. Crime scene photos from the school gymnasium. The abandoned silver heels. "Can you walk me through that night one more time?" Detective Rivera asked. Linda closed her eyes, forcing herself back to that evening. Sophie had been looking forward to prom for months. She'd saved her babysitting money to help pay for the dress. Her best friend Chloe came over to do their hair and makeup together. She paused, remembering the laughter that had filled her house that afternoon. Tyler picked her up at 7 o'clock sharp. He was a good kid, polite, on the honor roll. They'd been dating for about 6 months. They were supposed to be back by midnight. But then Principal Harrison called around 11:30. Linda's voice cracked slightly. He said Sophie was missing, that they'd found her shoes but couldn't locate her anywhere in the building. "What did Tyler tell you when you arrived at the school?" He was hysterical. Kept saying they'd been dancing, that everything was normal. He said Sophie had gone to the bathroom around 10:15 and just never came back. He waited for 20 minutes before he started asking other girls if they'd seen her. Detective Rivera pulled out another photograph showing the school's emergency exit door. "This is where her shoes were found. The door leads directly to the student parking lot. There were no security cameras in that area in 2009. Linda stared at the photo, trying to imagine what could have compelled her daughter to leave the dance and disappear into the night. Sophie wasn't the type to run away. She was responsible, excited about starting college. "Mrs. Caldwell," Detective Rivera said gently, "I need to show you what was found at the thrift shop." He reached for the evidence box with gloved hands and carefully lifted out a clear plastic bag. Inside was the dress, the emerald green fabric still beautiful despite showing signs of age. Linda's hand flew to her mouth as tears began to fall. "That's it," she whispered. "That's Sophie's dress." The woman who found it, Emma Rodriguez, works at Second Chance's Thrift. She said this dress was donated sometime last week in a large bag of mixed clothing. Unfortunately, they don't keep records of who makes donations. Linda reached toward the bag, then stopped herself. Can I touch it? Not yet. We're still processing it for evidence, but preliminary examination shows no signs of blood or obvious damage. However, there are some interesting details. He pulled out a magnifying glass and pointed to a small area near the dress's neckline. Do you see this small tear here? Linda leaned closer, her heart racing. She did remember that tear. Sophie had snagged the dress on her corsage pin while getting out of Tyler's car at the school. Sophie caught it on her corsage, Linda confirmed. Right before they went into the gym. Detective Rivera made another note. This helps confirm the dress's authenticity, but it raises new questions. If Sophie was wearing this dress when she disappeared, how did it end up in a donation bag 15 years later? Linda stared at the dress, at the fabric that had once held her daughter's warmth and dreams. The sight brought Sophie closer than she'd felt in years, but it also opened up terrifying new possibilities. Someone kept it, she said quietly. Someone kept my daughter's dress for 15 years and then decided to get rid of it. But why now? Second chances. Thrift shop sat wedged between a laundromat and a small Mexican restaurant on Elm Street, its windows filled with mannequins wearing outdated clothing and hand-lettered sale signs. Detective Rivera parked in front of the building, and Linda felt her pulse quicken as they approached the entrance. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and Linda was struck by the familiar smell of old fabric and mothballs. Racks of clothing stretched from floor to ceiling, while shelves displayed books and various knickknacks. A young woman with curly dark hair looked up from behind the counter, her name tag reading Emma Rodriguez. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with observant brown eyes and an easy smile that faltered when she noticed Detective Rivera's badge. You must be here about the dress, Emma said, setting down the jewelry she'd been sorting. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I called yesterday. Detective Rivera stepped forward, pulling out a small notebook. Ms. Rodriguez, can you walk us through exactly how you discovered the dress? Emma nodded, gesturing toward the back of the store. It was Tuesday morning, around 9 o'clock. I was processing a large donation that had been dropped off Monday evening. We have a slot in the back door where people can leave bags after hours. She led them through narrow aisles toward the rear, where sorting tables were covered with piles of clothing. The bag was huge, Emma continued. One of those black contractor bags, completely stuffed. Most of the clothes were newer items, casual wear. But then I found the dress wrapped in tissue paper at the very bottom. Linda's breath caught. Tissue paper? Yes, the kind you'd use for storing something special. It was yellowed with age, but the dress inside was in remarkable condition. When I saw how formal it was, and noticed the style was from the early 2000s, I thought it was unusual. Detective Rivera made notes. What made you think to contact the police? Emma's expression grew serious. It was the way it was packaged, so carefully preserved, and there was something else. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small plastic bag. I found this pinned to the inside of the dress. Through the clear plastic, Linda could see a corsage, its white roses now brown and brittle with age. The ribbon faded but still recognizable as the pale pink satin she remembered. Oh my God, Linda whispered. That's Sophie's corsage. Tyler gave it to her before they left for the dance. Detective Rivera examined the bag carefully. Ms. Rodriguez, you did the right thing preserving this. Can you think of anything else unusual about the donation? Emma shook her head. Everything else was pretty standard. Mostly women's clothes, size medium to large, contemporary brands. Nothing else that seemed particularly personal. Do you have security cameras that might have captured who made the donation? We do, but they only cover the interior during business hours. The after-hours drop slot isn't monitored. Emma paused. But I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lives above the restaurant next door. She's an insomniac and often looks out her window. Detective Rivera looked up with interest. Did she see anything? She noticed a dark sedan parked behind our building around midnight Monday. Thought it was strange because we don't usually get donations that late. She said the person seemed to be moving quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. Linda felt a chill. Someone had waited until midnight to dispose of Sophie's dress, choosing darkness to conceal their identity. Mrs. Chen couldn't make out details about the person or license plate. Emma continued. The streetlight back there burned out last month. Detective Rivera handed Emma his business card. If you think of anything else, please call immediately. As they prepared to leave, Linda turned back to Emma. What made you look more closely at the dress? Emma's expression softened. I have a younger sister. She's 17 now, the same age your daughter was. I remember my mom talking about that case when I was in middle school. When I saw that dress, so carefully preserved, I couldn't shake the feeling that it belonged to someone who never got to wear it home. Outside, Linda and Detective Rivera stood on the sidewalk as afternoon shadows stretched across the street. The discovery of the corsage had shaken Linda more than she'd expected. Someone hadn't just kept Sophie's dress. They'd preserved every detail of that night. Whoever donated that dress knows exactly what happened to Sophie, Detective Rivera said quietly. The question is whether they were involved in her disappearance or if they've been protecting someone who was. Tyler Matthews lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, the kind of neighborhood where front yards were well maintained and children's bicycles lay scattered on driveways. Detective Rivera had called ahead, and Tyler was waiting for them on his front porch when they arrived. A tall man in his early 30s with prematurely graying hair and worried eyes. Linda's heart clenched when she saw him. The last time they'd spoken was at Sophie's memorial service 2 years after the disappearance, when hope had finally begun to fade into resignation. Mrs. Caldwell, Tyler said softly as she approached, I heard about the dress. I can't believe it's been found after all this time. Detective Rivera introduced himself. Mr. Matthews, I know this is difficult, but we need to go over that night again. Fresh evidence sometimes brings back forgotten details. Tyler led them into his living room, where family photos lined the mantel. Linda noticed there were no pictures from high school, no prom photos that might serve as painful reminders. I've thought about that evening every day for 15 years, Tyler began, settling into a worn armchair. I've gone over it in my mind, so many times, wondering if I missed something. Detective Rivera pulled out his notebook. Walk me through the last hour before Sophie disappeared. How was she acting? Tyler closed his eyes, transporting himself back to that gymnasium. We'd been dancing for most of the evening. Sophie was having such a good time. She loved the music, kept saying how perfect everything was. His voice caught slightly. Around 10 o'clock, we took a break to get some punch. That's when she mentioned feeling warm, said she might step outside for fresh air after she used the restroom. Did she seem upset about anything? Problems with friends, teachers, other students? No, nothing like that. Sophie was popular, well-liked. She was excited about graduation, about starting college at Iowa State. Tyler paused. That's what made her disappearance so impossible to understand. She wasn't the type to run away. Linda leaned forward. Tyler, did Sophie mention anyone bothering her recently? Phone calls, messages, someone following her? Tyler shook his head. She would have told me. We talked about everything. She was excited about college, nervous about leaving Cedar Falls, but not scared of anything specific. Detective Rivera made notes. What about when she went to the restroom? Did you see her talking to anyone? I watched her walk across the gym floor. She waved at some friends, said hi to Mrs. Peterson, the English teacher who was chaperoning. Everything seemed normal. Tyler's expression grew haunted. I should have gone with her. You couldn't have known, Linda said gently. When did you realize she'd been gone too long? Detective Rivera asked. At first, I thought maybe she'd run into friends in the bathroom. You know how girls are. But after 20 minutes, I started asking other students if they'd seen her. Chloe, her best friend, went to check the bathroom, but Sophie wasn't there. Tyler stood and walked to the window. That's when I started to panic. I looked everywhere. The hallways, other classrooms, even went outside to check the parking lot. Her car was still there, keys in her purse at our table. The emergency exit, where her shoes were found, Detective Rivera said. Was that door usually used during school events? Not really. It was supposed to be alarmed, but everyone knew the alarm had been broken for months. Sometimes couples would sneak out there for privacy, but it led to the back parking lot. Detective Rivera leaned forward. Tyler, I need you to think carefully. In the days or weeks before prom, did Sophie mention anyone new in her life? Someone who might have been paying attention to her that made her uncomfortable? Tyler was quiet for a long moment. There was something, he said slowly. About a week before prom, Sophie mentioned that she felt like someone was watching her. She said it was probably just her imagination, but a couple of times she thought she saw the same car following her home from work. Linda's blood ran cold. She never told me that. She didn't want to worry you. She said it was probably nothing, maybe just someone who lived in the same direction. Tyler turned back to them. But now, knowing about the dress being preserved all these years, what if she was right? What if someone had been watching her? Detective Rivera closed his notebook and stood. Mr. Matthews, thank you for your time. If you remember anything else, please call me immediately. Outside Tyler's house, Detective Rivera and Linda sat in the car for a moment, processing what they'd learned. The revelation that Sophie had felt watched cast her disappearance in an entirely new light. Someone was stalking her, Linda said quietly. Someone planned this. Detective Rivera started the engine. And whoever it was, they kept that dress as a trophy for 15 years. The Cedar Falls High School hadn't changed much since 2009. The same brick facade, the same oak trees lining the circular drive, the same sense of youthful energy that seemed to permeate the air even during summer break. Detective Rivera had arranged to meet with Principal Harrison, who had been vice principal during Sophie's senior year. Linda felt her chest tighten as they walked through the main entrance. The hallways were empty now, echoing with ghosts of teenage laughter and locker doors slamming. She tried not to think about how Sophie had walked these same corridors just hours before she vanished. Principal Harrison met them in the main office, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had been the one to call Linda that terrible night 15 years ago. Mrs. Caldwell, she said warmly, extending her hand. I've thought about Sophie so many times over the years. She was such a bright, lovely girl. I'm glad to hear there might finally be some answers. Detective Rivera pulled out his notebook as they settled into chairs. Principal Harrison, we're hoping you might remember details from that night that weren't included in the original police report. Principal Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I was one of the chaperones that evening. I remember the night clearly, because it was such a beautiful event until everything went wrong. The students were all so excited, dressed up, having a wonderful time. She paused, her expression growing serious. I remember when Tyler came looking for Sophie. At first we thought maybe she'd stepped outside for fresh air. It wasn't uncommon for students to wander during dances. When did you realize something was genuinely wrong? Detective Rivera asked. When we found her shoes by the emergency exit. Sophie was responsible, mature. She wouldn't have left her shoes behind and wandered off barefoot. Linda leaned forward. Did you notice anyone at the dance who didn't belong? Any adults who weren't supposed to be there? Principal Harrison considered this carefully. We had our usual security measures in place. All attendees had to show tickets at the door, and we had teachers stationed at entrances. But there was something odd earlier that evening. Detective Rivera looked up with interest. What kind of something? Around 8:30, maybe 9 o'clock, one of our maintenance staff, Jerry Whitman, mentioned that he'd seen someone in the parking lot who seemed to be watching the building. Jerry was emptying trash cans outside when he noticed a man sitting in a dark car, just observing the school. Linda's heart began to race. This matched what Tyler had said about Sophie feeling watched. Did Jerry get a good look at this person? Detective Rivera asked. Not really. It was getting dark, and the person was sitting in his car, Jerry said when he walked closer to get a better look. The car drove away quickly. We assumed it was just a parent dropping off a student. Principal Harrison stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder. I brought this in case it might be helpful. It's the original incident report from that night, along with some photos from the dance. She spread several photographs across the table. Linda's breath caught as she saw images of Sophie throughout the evening, radiant, in her emerald dress, laughing with friends, dancing with Tyler. These were taken by various parents and students, Principal Harrison explained. After Sophie disappeared, families submitted them to help with the investigation. Detective Rivera studied the photos carefully. Principal Harrison, do you still have contact information for Jerry Whitman? I'm afraid Jerry passed away about 5 years ago. Heart attack. But his wife, Margaret, still lives in town. She might remember if Jerry mentioned anything else about that evening. As they continued reviewing the photos, Detective Rivera paused, at one image showing the gymnasium from a wider angle. In the background, barely visible through the windows, was the parking lot. Can you make out any vehicles in this photo? He asked, handing Linda a magnifying glass. Linda peered at the image, trying to discern details in the shadows. There were several cars visible, but most were too far away to make out clearly. However, in one corner, she could just make out what appeared to be a sedan parked at an odd angle. That car, she said, pointing to the vehicle. It's positioned. Strangely, like someone was in a hurry. Principal Harrison looked at the photo and frowned. Now that you mention it, I remember Jerry saying the person in the car seemed nervous, kept starting the engine and then turning it off again, like they were waiting for something specific. Detective Rivera made detailed notes and asked to keep copies of the photographs. As they prepared to leave, Principal Harrison walked them to the emergency exit where Sophie's shoes had been found. The door opened onto a section of the parking lot that was poorly lit, surrounded by trees that would have provided perfect cover for someone waiting. Mrs. Caldwell, Principal Harrison said softly, I want you to know that we've never forgotten Sophie. Every year on prom night, I think about her. As they walked back to their car, Detective Rivera was quiet, lost in thought. Finally, he turned to Linda. Someone was definitely stalking Sophie. The car Tyler mentioned, the man Jerry saw watching the school. This wasn't random. Someone planned this carefully. Margaret Whitman lived in a small white house with blue shutters on Maple Street, her front porch adorned with hanging baskets of petunias that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. When she answered the door, Linda was struck by how frail the elderly woman appeared, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the door frame. Mrs. Whitman? I'm Detective Rivera, and this is Linda Caldwell. We called earlier about speaking with you regarding your late husband, Jerry. Recognition flickered in the woman's pale blue eyes. Oh yes, about that poor girl who disappeared. Please, come in. I've been thinking about that night ever since you called. The living room was filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life, photographs covering every surface, showcasing decades of family gatherings and milestones. Margaret gestured for them to sit on a floral-patterned sofa while she settled into what was obviously her usual chair, a worn recliner positioned perfectly to watch both the television and the street outside. I still miss Jerry terribly, Margaret began, her voice soft but steady. He passed 5 years ago this October, but I remember that prom night clearly because he came home so upset about what he'd seen. Detective Rivera leaned forward, pen poised over his notebook. What exactly did he tell you about that evening? Margaret's eyes grew distant as she recalled the memory. Jerry had been working late that night, cleaning up after some kind of school event earlier in the week. He was emptying the trash cans in the parking lot when he noticed a car that had been sitting there for quite some time, engine running. She paused to sip from a glass of water on the table beside her chair. What bothered Jerry was that the person inside seemed to be watching the building, not waiting for someone to come out. Jerry said the man had binoculars or some kind of scope, and he was focused on the gymnasium windows. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. Binoculars? That's what Jerry thought. When Jerry started walking toward the car to see if the persons needed help, the man quickly put something down and drove away fast, tires squealing. Jerry said it felt wrong, predatory somehow. Detective Rivera made careful notes. Did Jerry get a look at the car's license plate? Margaret shook her head. It was too dark, and the car left so quickly. But Jerry was good with cars, worked on them as a hobby. He said it was a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue, possibly a Honda or Toyota. Something mid-sized and common. Not old, but not brand new either. What about the person inside? Any details about appearance? Jerry only got a glimpse, but he said it was a man, probably middle-aged based on his build. He was wearing something dark, maybe a baseball cap. Jerry wished he'd gotten a better look, especially after that poor girl went missing. Margaret stood slowly and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. She returned with a worn spiral notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Jerry kept a work diary, she explained, flipping through the pages. He wrote down anything unusual that happened at the school. Here it is, May 15, 2009. She handed the notebook to Detective Rivera, pointing to an entry written in Jerry's careful handwriting. Man in dark sedan watching school during prom. Suspicious behavior. Left quickly. When approached. Should report to police? Detective Rivera studied the entry. Did Jerry ever report this to the police? Margaret's expression grew sad. He called the police station the next morning after he heard about the girl disappearing, but the officer who took his call said they already had several reports of suspicious vehicles, and without a license plate or better description, there wasn't much they could do. Linda felt a surge of frustration. If the police had taken Jerry's report more seriously, perhaps they might have found Sophie sooner or prevented her disappearance altogether. Mrs. Whitman, Linda said gently, is there anything else Jerry mentioned about that night? Any other details, no matter how small they might seem? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying the fabric of her sweater. There was one thing Jerry found odd. After the car drove away, he walked over to where it had been parked to see if the person had dropped anything. He found cigarette butts on the ground, like someone had been sitting there for a long time, smoking and waiting. Did Jerry keep the cigarette butts? Detective Rivera asked hopefully. Oh no, he just swept them up with the rest of the trash. But he mentioned that they were a specific brand, something with a red stripe on the filter. Jerry smoked Marlboros himself, so he noticed when people smoked different brands. Detective Rivera made another note. Mrs. Whitman, you've been incredibly helpful. Is there anything else from that time period that Jerry mentioned? Any other suspicious incidents at the school? Margaret thought carefully. Not at the school specifically, but Jerry did mention seeing that same dark sedan around town a few times in the weeks before the prom. Once at the grocery store parking lot, another time near the high school during regular school hours. He started to think someone was watching the students, maybe targeting that poor girl specifically. As they prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the door, moving slowly but with determination. Detective Rivera, I hope you find out what happened to that girl. Jerry never got over feeling like he should have done more that night. He always wondered if he could have prevented what happened. Outside Margaret's house, Linda and Detective Rivera sat in the car, processing what they'd learned. The evidence was mounting that Sophie had been systematically stalked by someone who had planned her abduction carefully. He was watching her. For weeks, Linda said quietly. Following her, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Detective Rivera nodded grimly. And prom night gave him exactly what he was looking for. A crowded event, lots of confusion, and Sophie stepping outside alone into a poorly lit area. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb. "We need to check if there are any other reports from that time period about suspicious vehicles or people watching the school. Someone else might have seen this man and not realized the significance." Linda stared out the window at the passing houses, each one representing a family, a life, a story. Somewhere in this town, or perhaps long gone by now, was the person who had stolen her daughter's future. But for the first time in 15 years, she felt like they were getting close to finding him. The dress, the corsage, Jerry's observations, Tyler's memories of Sophie feeling watched, all the pieces were slowly coming together, painting a picture of a predator who had marked Sophie as his target and waited patiently for the right moment to strike. Margaret Whitman lived in a small white house with blue shutters on Maple Street, her front porch adorned with hanging baskets of petunias. When she answered the door, Linda was struck by how frail the elderly woman appeared, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mrs. Whitman? I'm Detective Rivera, and this is Linda Caldwell. We called earlier about speaking with you regarding your late husband, Jerry." Recognition flickered in the woman's pale blue eyes. "Oh yes, about that poor girl who disappeared. Please come in. I've been thinking about that night ever since you called." The living room was filled with photographs covering every surface, showcasing decades of family gatherings. Margaret gestured for them to sit on a floral-patterned sofa while she settled into her usual chair. "I still miss Jerry terribly," Margaret began, her voice soft but steady. "He passed 5 years ago this October, but I remember that prom night clearly because he came home so upset about what he'd seen." Detective Rivera leaned forward, pen poised. "What exactly did he tell you about that evening?" Margaret's eyes grew distant. Jerry had been working late that night, cleaning up after some school event. He was emptying trash cans in the parking lot when he noticed a car that had been sitting there for quite some time, engine running. She paused to sip from a glass of water. What bothered Jerry was that the person inside seemed to be watching the building, not waiting for someone. Jerry said the man had binoculars, and he was focused on the gymnasium windows. Linda felt a chill. Binoculars? That's what Jerry thought. When Jerry started walking toward the car, the man quickly put something down and drove away fast, tires squealing. Jerry said it felt wrong, predatory somehow. Detective Rivera made notes. "Did Jerry get a look at the license plate?" Margaret shook her head. "Too dark, and the car left so quickly. But Jerry was good with cars. He said it was a dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue, possibly a Honda or Toyota. Not old, but not brand new either." "What about the person inside?" Jerry only got a glimpse, but he said it was a man, probably middle-aged based on his build. He was wearing something dark, maybe a baseball cap. Margaret stood slowly and walked to a small desk, returning with a worn spiral notebook. "Jerry kept a work diary," she explained, flipping through pages. "He wrote down anything unusual that happened at the school. Here it is, May 15th, 2009. She handed the notebook to Detective Rivera, pointing to an entry in Jerry's careful handwriting. "Man in dark sedan watching school during prom. Suspicious behavior. Left quickly when approached. Should report to police." Detective Rivera studied the entry. "Did Jerry ever report this?" Margaret's expression grew sad. "He called the police station the next morning after he heard about the girl disappearing, but the officers said they already had several reports of suspicious vehicles, and without a license plate, there wasn't much they could do." Linda felt frustrated. If police had taken Jerry's report more seriously, perhaps they might have found Sophie sooner. "Mrs. Whitman," Linda said gently, "is there anything else Jerry mentioned about that night?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "There was one thing Jerry found odd. After the car drove away, he walked over to where it had been parked. He found cigarette butts on the ground, like someone had been sitting there for a long time, smoking and waiting." "Did Jerry keep the cigarette butts?" Detective Rivera asked. "Oh no, he just swept them up. but he mentioned they were a specific brand, something with a red stripe on the filter. Jerry smoked Marlboros himself, so he noticed when people smoked different brands. Detective Rivera made another note. Anything else from that time period that Jerry mentioned? Margaret thought carefully. Jerry did mention seeing that same dark sedan around town a few times in the weeks before prom. Once at the grocery store parking lot, another time near the high school during regular hours. He started to think someone was watching the students, maybe targeting that poor girl specifically. As they prepared to leave, Margaret walked them to the door. Detective Rivera, I hope you find out what happened to that girl. Jerry never got over feeling like he should have done more that night. Outside Margaret's house, Linda and Detective Rivera sat in the car processing what they'd learned. The evidence was mounting that Sophie had been systematically stalked. He was watching her for weeks, Linda said quietly. Following her, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Detective Rivera nodded grimly. And prom night gave him exactly what he was looking for. A crowded event, lots of confusion, and Sophie stepping outside alone. He started the engine. We need to check if there are other reports from that time about suspicious vehicles. Someone else might have seen this man. Linda stared out the window, at the passing houses. Somewhere was the person who had stolen her daughter's future. But for the first time in 15 years, she felt like they were getting close to finding him. The Cedar Falls Police Department's records room was a windowless basement space that smelled of dust and old paper, metal filing cabinets stretching from floor to ceiling like gray sentinels. Detective Rivera had requested all incident reports from the spring of 2009, and now he and Linda sat at a small table surrounded by boxes of files, searching for any mention of suspicious vehicles around the time of Sophie's disappearance. Linda's fingers were already stained with dust as she carefully lifted each report from the stack, reading through complaints about noise violations, minor traffic accidents, and domestic disputes. The mundane details of small-town life felt surreal when measured against what had happened to Sophie. Here's something, Detective Rivera said, holding up a thin report dated May 10, 2009. 5 days before prom, a woman named Carol Jensen called to report a man taking pictures of students outside the high school. She was picking up her daughter from track practice when she noticed him sitting in a dark car with a camera. Linda looked up from her stack. What did the police do? According to this, an officer drove by the school later that afternoon, but the car was gone. No follow-up investigation. Detective Rivera's voice carried frustration. If they'd taken it more seriously... He set the report aside and continued searching. Linda found herself reading each document with growing unease. There were more reports than she'd expected, scattered across several weeks, each one dismissed, as isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger pattern. A store clerk at the pharmacy where Sophie worked had called about a customer who seemed to be watching the teenage employees. A neighbor had reported a car parked on their street for hours, with someone inside watching houses. Parents at the Dewey Elementary School had mentioned seeing the same sedan near the playground on multiple occasions. Linda, look at this, Detective Rivera said, his voice tight with excitement. He held up another report, dated May the 8th. A teacher named Mrs. Patricia Coleman reported that one of her students mentioned seeing a man taking pictures of girls. Walking home from school, the student said the man was driving a dark sedan and had been parked near the coffee shop where teenagers hang out after school. Linda felt a chill of recognition. Sophie went to that coffee shop all the time. She and her friends would stop there after school to do homework. Detective Rivera stood and walked to a large map of Cedar Falls pinned to the wall. Using a red marker, he began placing dots at each location mentioned in the reports. The coffee shop, the high school, the pharmacy where Sophie worked, the elementary, school playground, the various streets where the suspicious car had been spotted. As the dots accumulated on the map, a clear pattern emerged. All the sightings formed a rough circle around the places where Sophie spent most of her time. Her school, her job, her favorite hangout spots, even the route she typically took walking home. He was mapping her entire life, Linda whispered, staring at the constellation of red dots, learning her schedule, her habits, where she felt safe. Detective Rivera returned to the table and pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling the state crime lab. We need to see if any of these reports match similar patterns in other jurisdictions. If this guy was stalking Sophie for weeks, there's a chance he's done this before." While Detective Rivera made his call, Linda continued reading through the remaining reports. Near the bottom of her stack, she found something that made her hands shake. A report filed by the manager of Murphy's department store, dated May 13th, just 2 days before prom. The manager had called to report a man asking unusual questions about a teenage girl who worked in the store's junior clothing section. The man had claimed to be shopping for his daughter, but when pressed for details, he'd become evasive. Instead, he'd asked specific questions about when the girl worked, what her schedule was like, and whether she ever worked alone. The girl he'd been asking about was Sophie. "Detective Rivera," Linda called out, her voice barely steady. "You need to see this." He ended his call and hurried back to the table. Linda handed him the report with trembling fingers. As he read, his expression grew darker. The store manager describes the man as middle-aged, average height, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, driving a dark sedan. Detective Rivera looked up at Linda. This was 2 days before prom. He was finalizing his plans. Linda felt sick. While she had been helping Sophie pick out accessories for her dress, a predator had been at Sophie's workplace, gathering intelligence for an abduction. "Mrs. Caldwell, this level of surveillance suggests we're dealing with someone who has done this before. The methodical approach, the weeks of observation. This wasn't his first time." Detective Rivera's phone rang, and his increasingly grim expression told the story as he listened. "The crime lab is checking their database for similar patterns of stalking behavior," he said after hanging up. "If there are other cases with the same methodology, we might be able to identify a suspect." Linda stared at the map with its damning pattern of red dots. For weeks, while she and Sophie had been living their normal lives, someone had been watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The dress preserved for 15 years suddenly made more sense. It wasn't just a trophy. It was a memento of a carefully executed plan. And now, after all these years, something had compelled him to finally let it go. The call from the state crime lab came at 7:30 the next morning, jarring Linda from the first decent sleep she'd had in days. Detective Rivera's voice was tight with urgency when she answered her phone. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to come to the station immediately. The lab found something significant." Linda was dressed and out the door within 15 minutes, her heart pounding as she drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Detective Rivera was waiting for her in the lobby, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. He led her quickly to the conference room, but now the table was covered with files, photographs, and a large map marked with colored pins. "The crime lab analyst worked through the night," Detective Rivera began. "What we discovered is both encouraging and terrifying. The pattern of surveillance we found in Sophie's case matches 3 other disappearances across the Midwest over the past 20 years. Linda sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. 3 other girls. Jennifer Walsh, age 16, disappeared from Bloomington, Illinois in 2003. Casey Morrison, 17, vanished from Springfield, Missouri in 2006. And Rebecca Turner, also 17, went missing from Topeka, Kansas in 2012. Detective Rivera pointed to 3 separate files. In each case, there were reports of a man in a dark sedan photographing teenage girls, asking questions about specific victims at their workplaces, displaying the same methodical surveillance pattern. Linda's hands trembled as she reached for the first file. Jennifer Walsh smiled back at her from a school photo, a pretty blonde girl with braces and bright eyes. She looked so young, so trusting. So much like Sophie. What happened to them? Linda whispered. Detective Rivera's expression grew grim. Jennifer's body was found 6 months after she disappeared, in a wooded area 50 miles from where she was taken. Casey and Rebecca were never found, but evidence suggests they met the same fate. He opened the second file revealing crime scene photographs. In Jennifer's case, her prom dress was discovered with her remains. It had been carefully preserved, just like Sophie's, before being left with the body. Linda felt the room spinning. The careful preservation of the dress wasn't just about keeping a trophy. It was part of this monster's ritual, his signature. In each case, the perpetrator chose victims based on a specific profile. Detective Rivera continued. High school juniors or seniors, popular girls with bright futures, all planning to attend prom or similar formal events. He pulled out a photograph, showing all 4 girls side by side. Jennifer, Casey, Rebecca, and Sophie. Despite their different features, there was something similar about them all, a brightness, an innocence that had made them targets. The FBI has been tracking this case for years, Detective Rivera explained. They call him the Prom Night Predator. He moves from state to state, sometimes waiting years between attacks. He's disciplined, patient, and extremely careful. Linda stared at the photographs, her heart breaking for the other mothers. Why is he getting rid of Sophie's dress now? After all these years? Detective Rivera walked to the large map showing the locations of all 4 disappearances. Red pins marked where each girl had vanished, connected by lines showing a geographical pattern moving westward over time. The FBI profiler believes he's either dying, preparing to disappear permanently, or getting ready to escalate his activities, Detective Rivera said. The disposal of evidence could mean he's cleaning house before making a major move. The thought sent ice through Linda's veins. You think he's planning to take another girl? It's possible. His cooling-off periods have been getting shorter. 6 years between Jennifer and Casey. 3 years between Casey and Rebecca. Only 12 years between Rebecca and now. Detective Rivera opened a thick folder marked FBI Profile. The suspect is likely a white male, aged 50 to 65, with a steady job that allows him to travel easily. He's organized, methodical, and has probably lived in each community where attacks occurred. Linda studied the profile information. How do we find him? We're cross-referencing employment records, rental agreements, and utility connections for people who lived in all 4 areas during the relevant time periods, Detective Rivera explained. We're also working with local media to release information about the pattern. Linda looked again at the photographs of the 4 girls. Detective Rivera, I want to help with the investigation. I want to do whatever I can to catch this monster. Mrs. Caldwell, this is dangerous. If our suspect realizes we're closing in, he might become desperate. Linda met his eyes with determination. He's already taken my daughter. I'm not going to let him take anyone else's. Detective Rivera studied her, then nodded slowly. There is something you could help with. We need to reach out to the other families. They might remember details that weren't included in the original reports. Linda felt a sense of purpose wash over her for the first time in 15 years. I'll make those calls today. As she prepared to leave, Linda turned back to Detective Rivera. Do you really think we can catch him after all this time? Mrs. Caldwell, for the first time since this investigation began, I believe we have a real chance. He made a mistake by disposing of that dress. And mistakes are how we catch the smart ones. Linda spent the afternoon in her kitchen, staring at the phone numbers Detective Rivera had given her, gathering courage to make calls that would reopen wounds she knew had never fully healed. The first number belonged to Carol Walsh, in Bloomington, Illinois, Jennifer's mother. The second was for Patricia Morrison in Springfield, Missouri, Casey's mother. When Linda finally dialed Carol Walsh's number, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. The phone rang 3 times before a weary voice answered. Hello? Mrs. Walsh? This is Linda Caldwell. I'm calling from Cedar Falls, Iowa. My daughter Sophie disappeared 15 years ago, and the police believe it might be connected to what happened to your Jennifer. There was a long silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Oh my God! They found him? Not yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. The FBI has connected our cases. I was hoping you might remember details that could help us identify him. Carol's voice broke slightly. I've been waiting 21 years for this phone call. Please, tell me everything. For the next hour, Linda and Carol shared their stories, their grief, their memories of daughters who had been stolen in their prime. Carol remembered details that hadn't made it into the police reports. How Jennifer had mentioned feeling watched in the weeks before her disappearance. How she'd found cigarette butts in their driveway, the same brand with red stripes that Jerry Whitman had noticed at the school. There was something else, Carol said, her voice growing stronger. Jennifer worked at a small boutique in the mall. About a week before she disappeared, her manager called me because a man had come in asking specific questions about Jennifer's schedule. He claimed to be planning a surprise party for his daughter. Linda felt a chill of recognition. The same thing happened at Sophie's workplace. He was gathering information about their schedules. The manager described him as middle-aged, polite, well-dressed. Nothing particularly memorable except that he seemed nervous, kept checking his watch. Carol paused. Jennifer mentioned seeing the same man at the coffee shop where she and her friends studied. He was always sitting alone, reading a newspaper, but she felt like he was watching them. When Linda called Patricia Morrison in Springfield, she found a woman who had become an advocate for missing persons, channeling her grief into helping other families. Patricia's memory was sharp, her notes detailed. Casey mentioned seeing the same car following her home from work several times, Patricia said. She was nervous about it, asked her father to pick her up instead of walking. The car was a dark sedan. She said the driver wore sunglasses even when it was cloudy. Patricia had kept a journal during the weeks after Casey's disappearance. There was a man who came to our house about a month before Casey went missing. He claimed to be conducting a survey about teenage shopping habits for a marketing company, asked questions about Casey's routines, where she liked to shop. Did you get his name? Linda asked. He gave me a business card, but when I tried to call the company later, the number was disconnected. I still have the card somewhere. Linda could hear Patricia moving around, opening drawers and boxes. After several minutes, she returned to the phone. Found it. The card says Market Research Associates, and the name is David Miller. But the phone number was fake. Linda wrote down the information, her pulse quickening. A fake name, a phony business card, but possibly something that could be traced. Mrs. Morrison, there's something else. The police think he might be preparing to strike again. He disposed of evidence from my daughter's case, which could mean he's getting ready for another attack. Patricia's voice turned fierce. Then we have to stop him. I won't let another family go through what we've been through. After the calls ended, Linda sat in her kitchen as darkness fell outside, surrounded by pages of notes. 3 families, 3 daughters, all connected by a monster who had been hunting teenage girls for over 2 decades. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Detective Rivera's voice was tense with excitement. Mrs. Caldwell, we just got a break in the case. The FBI ran the name David Miller through their database, cross-referencing it with Market Research Associates and the geographical areas where attacks occurred. Linda gripped the phone tightly. Did you find him? Not exactly, but we found something almost as good. That fake business card Patricia Morrison kept? The printing was done by a company called Minuteman Press in Cedar Falls. It's been closed for 5 years, but the owner kept records. Linda felt her heart racing. The card was printed here? In Cedar Falls? 2 months before Sophie disappeared. The customer paid cash, but the owner remembered him because he was very specific about the card design and seemed nervous. The description matches our profile perfectly. Detective Rivera paused. Mrs. Caldwell, our suspect didn't just move to Cedar Falls to stalk Sophie. He's been here for years, maybe decades. This is his home base, the place he returns to between attacks. The implications hit Linda like a physical blow. The man who had taken Sophie wasn't some drifter who had moved on. He was still here, still living in Cedar Falls, possibly walking the same streets she walked every day. Detective Rivera, if he's still here, if he's been here all along, then we're going to find him, Detective Rivera said firmly. And this time, he won't slip away. But even as relief and hope flooded through her, Linda couldn't shake the terrifying thought that had been growing in her mind all day. If the Prom Night Predator was preparing for another attack, and if Cedar Falls was his home base, then somewhere in her town, another teenage girl might already be in his sights. Harold Kemp lived in a tidy ranch house on the east side of Cedars Falls, his front yard decorated with garden gnomes and wind chimes. The former owner of Minuteman Press was a man in his 70s with ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Detective Rivera had called ahead, and Harold was waiting for them on his front porch, a manila folder in his lap. Linda felt her pulse quicken as they approached. This man might have been face to face with Sophie's killer. Mr. Kemp, any details you can remember about the customer who ordered those business cards could be crucial, Detective Rivera said as they settled into porch chairs. Harold nodded, opening the folder to reveal receipts and order forms. I kept detailed records of unusual orders. This one definitely qualified. He pulled out a carbon copy dated March 15, 2009. 2 months before Sophie's disappearance, the handwriting was printed in careful block letters. What made this order unusual? Detective Rivera asked. Several things, Harold said, adjusting his glasses. First, the customer was very specific about the design but evasive about the business itself. When I asked what kind of market research the company did, he gave vague answers. Harold turned to a page in his notebook. Second, he paid in cash. Combined with his nervous behavior, it stood out. He kept checking his watch, looking over his shoulder like he was worried someone might see him. Linda felt a chill. Can you describe what he looked like? White male, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. Average height, maybe 5'10". Brown hair starting to gray, clean-shaven. He wore basic glasses, dressed like an office worker. Harold consulted his notes. What really stuck with me was his hands. Very clean, well-maintained, like someone who worked indoors. But he had small scars on his knuckles, little white lines that suggested he'd worked with tools or machinery. Detective Rivera made notes. Did he give you any indication of where he worked? Not directly, but when he was leaving, I saw him get into a dark blue sedan across the street. Well-maintained, but not new. Had a parking sticker in the back window. Linda's heart raced. What kind of parking sticker? That's what I've been trying to remember. It was rectangular, blue and white. Could have been for a hospital, school, maybe a government building, somewhere that required employee parking permits. Harold was quiet for a moment. There was one more thing. After he left, I realized he'd touched several surfaces in my shop. The counter, the door handle, the pen I'd handed him. The implication hit Linda immediately. Fingerprints. Exactly, Detective Rivera said. Mr. Kemp, do you still have anything he might have touched? Harold shook his head. The shop closed 5 years ago. Everything was cleaned out, but... He paused, reaching into his shirt pocket. I still carry the same pen I used back then. Force of habit. He definitely handled it. Detective Rivera's eyes lit up as Harold handed him a simple ballpoint pen, worn from years of use. Mr. Kemp, you might have just given us the break we've been looking for. After carefully bagging the pen as evidence, they spent another hour, going over details. The customer had arrived around 10 on a Tuesday morning, stayed about 15 minutes, and seemed relieved when the transaction was completed. He was definitely planning something, Harold said as they prepared to leave. The urgency, the nervousness, the fake information. By keeping such detailed records, you might have helped us catch the person responsible for my daughter's disappearance, Linda said gently. As they drove away, Detective Rivera was already arranging for the pen to be rushed to the state crime lab for fingerprint analysis. Linda stared out the window at Cedar Falls, wondering which house might be hiding the monster. About that parking sticker Harold mentioned. What if we checked with local employers who issue parking permits? Linda asked. Already thinking the same thing, Detective Rivera replied. I'm going to start with Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital and the school district. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from Emma Rodriguez. Mrs. Caldwell, I remembered something else about the night the dress was donated. Can you call me? Linda immediately dialed Emma's number. Mrs. Caldwell, I've been thinking about that night. My neighbor Mrs. Chen said the person who dropped off the donation moved like they were familiar with the area, like they knew exactly where our drop-off slot was located. What does that mean? Linda asked. Our drop-off slot is around back, not visible from the street. Someone would have to have been to our store before to know where it was. Mrs. Chen said the person went straight to it, no hesitation. Linda felt pieces clicking together. A local resident, someone who knew the town well enough to find a hidden drop-off slot in the dark. Emma, has Mrs. Chen seen anyone acting suspiciously around your store recently? Actually, yes, she mentioned, seeing the same dark car parked across the street several times in the past few weeks, always late at night. Linda's blood ran cold. He was still out there, still watching, still planning. Emma, if you or Mrs. Chen see that car again, call the police immediately. Don't approach it, just call 911. You're scaring me. Do you really think he's still in town? Linda looked at Detective Rivera, who was listening with growing concern. Yes, Emma. I think he's still here, and I think he's getting ready to strike again. The call came at 6 in the morning, 3 days after Harold Kemp had given them the pen. Linda jolted awake to the sound of her phone ringing, Detective Rivera's name flashing on the screen. Mrs. Caldwell, we got a match on the fingerprints, Detective Rivera said, his voice tight with excitement. And we have a name. Linda sat up in bed, fully alert. Who is he? Robert Morrison. 62 years old, works as a maintenance supervisor at Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital. He's been employed there for over 20 years. The pieces clicked into place immediately. The parking sticker Harold had seen, the clean hands with scars from working with tools, the knowledge of the town's layout. Robert Morrison had been hiding, in plain sight, working at the hospital just blocks from where Linda lived. Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to listen carefully, Detective Rivera continued. Morrison has taken vacation time from the hospital starting yesterday. His supervisor says he requested 2 weeks off for personal reasons and seemed agitated when pressed for details. Linda's blood turned to ice. He's getting ready to strike again. That's what we believe. The FBI profile suggested he might escalate if he felt pressured. Disposing of Sophie's dress, knowing we were investigating, might have triggered him to move faster than planned. Detective Rivera's voice became urgent. We've got units positioned around Morrison's apartment complex, but he's not there. His car is gone, and neighbors haven't seen him since yesterday morning. We've issued a BOLO alert for his vehicle, a 2015 dark blue Honda Accord. Linda was already getting out of bed, reaching for her clothes. What can I do to help? Right now, we need you to stay safe. If Morrison realizes we're closing in, there's no telling how he might react. But Linda's mind was racing ahead to the terrifying implications. Detective Rivera, if he's planning another attack, he's already chosen his victim. There's a teenage girl out there who's in danger right now. We're working on that. We've contacted the high school, asked them to identify students who match his victim profile. After hanging up, Linda couldn't sit still. She paced her kitchen, staring out the window at the quiet morning streets. The thought that he had been working at the hospital all these years, possibly walking past her on the street, shopping at the same stores, made her physically ill. Her phone rang again. This time it was Emma from the thrift shop. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sorry to call so early, but Mrs. Chen saw that car again last night. The dark sedan. It was parked across from our store around midnight." Linda gripped the phone tighter. "Did she get a license plate number?" "She tried, but the street light is still broken. She said it looked like someone was sitting in the driver's seat, but she couldn't make out details." "Emma, you need to call Detective Rivera immediately and report this. The man we're looking for took time off from work yesterday." Within an hour, Linda was at the police station, sitting in the same conference room where this nightmare had started. Detective Rivera had maps spread across the table, marked with red dots showing everywhere Robert Morrison had been spotted over the past 20 years. "We've been reconstructing his movements," Detective Rivera explained. "Morrison has worked at Cedar Falls Memorial since 2003. 2 years before he killed Jennifer Walsh in Illinois. He takes vacation time that corresponds exactly with each of the disappearances." Linda studied the timeline on the whiteboard. "He uses his job as cover, tells his supervisor he's taking time off, then drives to another state to hunt." "Exactly. And now he's doing it again, except this time he doesn't have to leave town. We believe he selected a victim here in Cedar Falls." FBI agent Sarah Chen, who had joined the investigation, pulled out a folder containing photographs of teenage girls. "We've identified 12 students at Cedar Falls High who match Morrison's victim profile. Popular girls, juniors, and seniors, involved in school activities, planning to attend prom next month." Linda's heart sank as she looked at the photos. 12 bright, smiling faces, each one representing someone's daughter. "We've assigned protection details to each of these girls," Agent Chen continued. "Plainclothes officers are monitoring their homes, their schools, their workplaces." Detective Rivera's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly, his expression growing grim. "Morrison's Honda Accord was spotted an hour ago in the parking lot of Westfield Shopping Center. Security cameras show him following a teenage girl through the mall." Agent Chen was immediately on her radio. "All units, we have a possible target acquisition at Westfield. Suspect is considered extremely dangerous." Linda felt helpless. Sitting in the conference room while somewhere across town, Robert Morrison was stalking another innocent girl. 15 years of wondering what had happened to Sophie, and now she knew. Morrison had taken her daughter, killed her, kept her dress as a trophy. "Mrs. Caldwell," Agent Chen said, noticing Linda's distress, "your daughter's case is what allowed us to connect all these crimes. Without Sophie's dress being found, Morrison might have continued killing for years." Detective Rivera ended a phone call and turned to them with urgent news. "Mall security has Morrison on camera, but they lost visual contact 5 minutes ago. The teenage girl he was following is Ashley Martinez, 17 years old, a senior at Cedar Falls High." Linda's chest tightened. Ashley Martinez was one of the girls in the photographs, one of the 12 they were supposed to be protecting. "Where are her parents?" Linda asked. "On their way to the mall. We've got every available unit converging on Westfield, but Morrison knows we're onto him now. He's cornered, desperate, and extremely dangerous." Agent Chen gathered her equipment. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to stay here where it's safe. We're going to end this today." As the law enforcement team rushed out, Linda was left alone with the photographs of 12 teenage girls spread across the table. One of them, Ashley Martinez, was somewhere in a shopping mall with a serial killer. For the first time in 15 years, Linda prayed that they would be in time to save someone else's daughter from the monster who had taken hers. The call came. 45 minutes later, just as Linda had given up hope of hearing anything before the evening news. Detective Rivera's voice was breathless but triumphant when he spoke. "We got him, Mrs. Caldwell. Robert Morrison is in custody, and Ashley Martinez is safe." Linda sank into her chair, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank God." Is she hurt? Shaken up, but physically unharmed. Morrison had cornered her in the parking garage, but mall security and our officers arrived just as he was approaching her car. He surrendered without a fight when he realized he was surrounded. Detective Rivera's voice grew more serious. Mrs. Caldwell, when we searched Morrison's apartment, we found a room that can only be described as a shrine. He had photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal items from all 4 victims, including things that belonged to Sophie. Linda's breath caught. What kind of things? Her school ID card, a bracelet, and a notebook with her handwriting. He also had detailed plans for what he was going to do to Ashley Martinez. Without Sophie's dress being found when it was, Ashley would have become his 5th victim. The weight of 15 years of grief suddenly felt lighter. Sophie's memory had not only brought her killer to justice, but had saved another girl's life. Detective Rivera, I need to know. What happened to Sophie? What did he tell you? There was a long pause. Morrison confessed to everything, Mrs. Caldwell. He said he'd been watching Sophie for weeks before prom night. He knew her schedule, her routines, her plans. When she stepped outside the gymnasium that night, he was waiting. Linda closed her eyes, finally hearing the truth she'd sought for so long. He said it was quick. Sophie tried to fight, but she was small, and he was prepared. He took her to a remote cabin he owned in the woods outside town. She didn't suffer long, Mrs. Caldwell. Morrison said she was brave until the end. Kept asking about you, wondering when you'd come looking for her. Tears flowed freely down Linda's face, but for the first time in 15 years, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of closure, of justice, of a daughter's love finally vindicated. Where is she, Detective Rivera? He's agreed to show us the location tomorrow. The district attorney has agreed to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for his full cooperation in recovering all the victims' remains. Linda nodded, understanding the bitter compromise. Morrison would spend the rest of his life in prison, but the families would finally be able to lay their daughters to rest. 3 weeks later, Linda stood in Riverside Cemetery under a canopy of spring flowers, surrounded by friends, family, and members of the community who had never forgotten Sophie Caldwell. The small white casket that held her daughter's remains was covered with the same emerald green as the dress Sophie had worn to prom 15 years ago. Pastor Williams spoke about love that transcends death, about how Sophie's memory had become a force for justice that protected other young women. Tyler Matthews stood with his wife and young daughter, tears streaming down his face as he remembered the girl he'd loved in high school. Emma Rodriguez from the Thrift shop was there, along with Harold Kemp, Margaret Whitman, and dozens of others, whose lives had been touched by the search for truth about Sophie's disappearance. As the service concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Linda remained by the graveside, finally able to say the words she'd carried in her heart for 15 years. Sophie, sweetheart, I'm so sorry it took me so long to bring you home. But you helped us catch the monster who took you. Ashley Martinez is alive because of you. Jennifer's parents finally have answers because of you. She placed a single red rose on the casket. I love you, baby girl. I always have, and I always will. Rest now. Your fight is over. 6 months later, Linda had received calls from the other families. Jennifer's remains had been found and returned. Patricia Morrison had been able to bury Casey at last. Rebecca Turner's parents had been located and informed that their daughter's case was finally closed. Robert Morrison had led authorities to all 4 burial sites, providing the closure that had eluded these families for decades. He was serving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, his hunting days over forever. Linda had started a foundation in Sophie's name, working with law enforcement agencies to improve communication in missing persons cases involving teenage girls. The Sophie Caldwell Foundation had already helped solve 3 cold cases in neighboring states. On what would have been Sophie's 33rd birthday, Linda visited the grave one more time. The headstone was simple, but beautiful, engraved with Sophie's name, dates, and a single line. Beloved daughter, who brought light into darkness. As Linda placed fresh flowers by the stone, she noticed a young woman approaching. She appeared to be in her late teens, with dark hair and a shy smile. "Mrs. Caldwell? I'm Ashley Martinez. I wanted to thank you." Linda looked at the girl whose life had been saved by Sophie's dress appearing in a thrift shop at exactly the right moment. "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. Thank Sophie. She's the one who saved you." Ashley placed her own bouquet of flowers next to Linda's. "I'm starting college in the fall. I'm going to study criminal justice, maybe become a detective. I want to help other families the way you helped mine." Linda smiled through her tears. Sophie's legacy would continue in ways she never could have imagined. Her daughter's brief life had become a beacon of hope for other families facing the darkness of missing loved ones. As they stood together in the quiet cemetery, Linda felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Sophie was finally home. The monster who had taken her was locked away forever. The prom dress that had started it all was now preserved in the FBI's evidence collection. But its real purpose had been fulfilled the moment Emma Rodriguez recognized that a 17-year-old girl's dream dress deserved better than to be forgotten. Sophie Caldwell had finally come home, and in doing so, she had made sure that no other family would have to endure 15 years of not knowing. Her memory had become a shield protecting other young women, and that was a legacy that would last forever.